Welcome everyone. Welcome to this event at the Swindon Spring Festival of Literature and the Arts, which we had planned to be a live event in May, but then along came this nasty virus that has affected us all, and means we either have to cancel or find another way of doing it. And like many people all over the UK and all over the world, we've been resourceful and we've found another way. And in fact, today's digital technology allows us to find another way, and that is to do things virtually online. So welcome to this virtual event at the Swindon Spring Festival. We hope all is well where you are. Now, we have a very interesting author and a very interesting book today. You've probably checked it up in your program or on our website. It's the 10 Steps to Positive Aging, or actually it's the 10 Steps of Positive Aging. And I'm intrigued by the preposition that the author chose, not to positive aging, but of positive aging. But we'll come to that. We'll come to lots of things. But before we do, I'd like you to meet today's author. So will you please join me in giving a Swindon Spring Festival welcome to Guy Robertson.
Thank you, Matt. That's very kind of you. And to thank you for the invitation to come to the Swindon Festival. I'm really honoured to be here. Thank you.
And it would have been nice if you'd been able to come here live, because we were promising you, as we do all lunchtime authors, a terrific homemade lunch. But that'll have to wait for another time. In fact, have you ever been to Swindon?
Matt, I've been to the festival many times. In fact, though we live in Bristol, we have on several occasions got up with our kids, our children, at about 3 o'clock in the morning to drive to the May Dawn event as part of the Swindon Festival on many occasions, and arrived bedraggled and tired at 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning. So yes, I'm very familiar with the festival and love it. It's a great event.
Oh, that's tremendous. Well, it's really great that you're coming here now in your own right as an author. And in fact, this is your chance to tell us a little bit about your book. And in it you say, growing old is something one has to take on, one has to work on, one has to take control of. We shouldn't just drift along, which is quite stern, because I'm sort of in your age target audience, and being told I have to work on it is, well, it's really quite exciting. And let's hear why, Guy. Thank you very much.
Good. Yes, Matt, you're definitely part of the demographic. And maybe a shining example. Yes, positive aging. What's that all about? Well, the first thing to say is the term positive is problematic. When I began to look at this, there were a lot of people using the term successful aging. And I very consciously chose not to use that word, because the minute you use successful, you bring into being the prospect of being unsuccessful. And the idea that you can age unsuccessfully or you can fail at aging, I thought was very pernicious. But the idea of positive aging is really very important. Its other difficulty, however, with positive is it tends to suggest the idea of a Pollyanna approach to aging. And as I go on, I hope you'll realize that I'm very clear that aging is not a Pollyanna experience, not trying to pretend it's all wonderful, very much the opposite. But I want to, before I go into that in detail, I want to start off with a little reading from the book, because there are two things that really brought me into this whole field of positive aging. And the first is encapsulated in this first reading from my book. There is nothing older than not wanting to grow old. Our world presents us with a disastrous image of old age. We are afraid of dying badly, of ending our lives alone, unloved, perhaps dependent, or suffering from dementia. Instead of confronting this fear, we ward it off by clinging to our youth in a rather pathetic state of denial. In so doing, we run the risk of missing out on what I call the work of growing old. That is to say, cultivating a positive awareness of aging. These are the first words by Marie de Hennezel, psychologist, psychotherapist, and special advisor to the French government on palliative care, in the preface to her 2008 book with the wonderful title, The Warmth of the Heart Prevents Your Body from Rusting. It was de Hennezel's book which first inspired me to think about approaches to aging. Contained within the above quote is the key idea that growing old is something one needs to work at. There is a job to be done to improve our experience of our own aging process. And part of that job is to develop a more positive attitude towards aging. To me, at that time, this was revolutionary. Her central notion that we can have more control over our aging process than we might otherwise think is still far from being a mainstream idea. So that was one of the, reading de Hennezel's book was one of the first things that really inspired me to go down this journey. And as you mentioned in your introduction, Matt, the bad news is you can't just relax now and let aging happen. In fact, the whole prospect, one of the central philosophies around positive aging is that aging is something we can have some control over, our own aging. We have agency, we have choices. We can do things to improve the chances of having better well-being in later life. For too many people, the idea of aging is a rather passive approach. It's something that happens. And people often seem to have this approach of being very, just sitting around waiting for the process to happen. It's nothing that you can affect. But de Hennezel really was quite inspiring about the ways that one can make a difference to one's own aging. And what I do in the book is take that central thesis and then provide people with very clear, accessible techniques of how they can put that into practice. And in doing so, I draw on a lot of the humanistic psychology that's around, either from positive psychology, from mindfulness, from cognitive behavioral therapy. These sorts of disciplines can give us the techniques to actually take some of that control and have agency in our aging. The second thing that really influenced me around the whole notion of positive aging was some research conducted by somebody at Harvard University in the States, a woman called Becca Levy. And she did a fascinating piece of research. She looked at their longitudinal study of aging. Excuse me, that's a study that takes place over many years and many decades, in fact, and asks people a series of questions every year or every 2 or 3 years during that period. From that research, Levy was able to distinguish in the older people that they interviewed year after year. They were able to identify those people who had positive approaches or positive attitudes towards their own aging and those people who had negative attitudes towards their own aging. And when she then went and cross-referenced these two cohorts of people with the death records, she found the surprising result that those people who had a positive attitude towards their own aging lived on average 7.5 years longer than those people with negative attitudes towards their own aging. Now I find that absolutely fantastic and fascinating, that the idea that an attitude, a set of beliefs could have that sort of impact on such a clearly measurable outcome, i.e. longevity, was quite revolutionary. And when you look at some of the public health measures around, like reducing obesity or stopping smoking or reducing cholesterol levels, none of them have that sort of impact, 7.5 years on longevity. Now, if Becca Levy was the only one to find that sort of research, you could rightly be very skeptical. Over the last decade, I've been looking into this subject in great detail, and I have a mass of research data in this whole field, which backs up this idea that not only does it affect longevity, it affects the prevalence of illness amongst older people, how ill they are ill for and how they recover. It affects people's ability to live independently, it affects mental well-being and all the rest of it. And you'll find in the book, there's a whole host of research data to back up the claims. So there's two very important things there. The idea about agency and the idea that what we think about, our attitudes towards aging, can have a big impact on our outcomes. So that's what the book really focuses on. I look at in very practical ways about how we can then take these two central theses and apply them in a practical way to our own lives. So the 10 steps can be summarized in a number of ways. The first one, and perhaps interestingly quite unusual, is to look at death and to face up to mortality. And the reason we're starting with that is to quote, I think Steve, his name's gone clear out of my head, to quote the quote about it's best to start with the end in mind. And when it comes to aging, we can't escape the fact that death is on the horizon for all of us. It is the one thing that is certain, is that we are going to die. The one thing we haven't a clue about is when that will happen and how. So given that paradox, it is really interesting and important to face up to death. As Carl Jung said, those things that we don't address, those things that we try and avoid, persist. And tend to actually increase in their impact on our lives. So sweeping the whole notion of death under the carpet is not really helpful for us. And in fact, death doesn't have to be a morbid thing. There's a lot of fear and anxiety around death, and I address that very head on in the book and suggest ways in which people can begin to deal with or reduce some of that anxiety. But the important thing is that death really gives us a huge motivation for living life to the full. And that is why I felt it really important to start with that. If we recognize and embrace the fact that our lives are limited, then it again helps to motivate us to do things about it and make the most of our lives. The second thing, and step 2 of the book, is then to look at some of the negativity there is around aging. And I talk about trying to really to call out the fake news that there is on aging. Now, I'm not suggesting, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, that aging is all fine. It is not. The whole aspect of aging, the whole framework of aging is one of loss. We will lose our loved ones. We will lose our life. We will tend to lose our physical abilities, and we may well lose some of our mental abilities. So that is definitely part of the whole picture, and there's no point in escaping that. But what I think is important is to try and balance some of that negativity around aging, which is very skewed and one-sided. And what I do look at in the book is some of the evidence which suggests that actually the real experience of aging is nothing like as bad as people expect, particularly around things like health, where people expect aging all to be about a downward spiral into poor health and unhappiness. Well, it's some very interesting research, and I can't talk about it all here, but one that really stands out was research conducted by Professor Tom Kirkwood, who gave the Ruth Lectures on Aging a number of years ago. And his research showed that over 85-year-olds in a very large representative sample felt that their health and well-being at 80, over 85, 80% of them felt was good, very good, or excellent. So there's a lot of evidence to show that aging is nothing as bad as you might believe in the press. And again, when we come to things like dementia, most people assume that the percentage of people who live with dementia is absolutely huge. Well, actually, even in the 80 to 85-year-old bracket, which is towards very older ages, it's only about 10 or 11% of people in that age bracket are living with dementia. So we have to kind of rebalance some of the ideas around aging. And that leads on to the way that our attitudes and beliefs can affect our health and well-being outcomes. I mentioned that in the beginning, but I go into a lot more detail on Becca Levy's and our other colleagues' research in this, and again give very clear suggestions how we can address that. Step 4 is really looking at relationships, and relationships as we get older are so important. If there's one thing to take away from the book, it would be the need for us to actually, again, take some action to make sure we maintain our relationships and build new relationships. The evidence is very clear that one of the central things that can maintain well-being in life is connections with others. Step 5 looks at mindfulness, and that has some very important benefits for people as they age. The whole mindfulness movement came out from somebody called John Kabat-Zinn, who worked in the pain clinic in a hospital in Massachusetts in the States. And he asked his colleagues to give him the most difficult cases, the people for whom the drugs that they were using in the pain clinic were not effective. And he then trained them in mindfulness, the sort of meditation techniques that he's developed, and was able to show how people's pain could be much more manageable through that mental discipline. There are a number of other great benefits from mindfulness, but given the fact that as we age, long-term discomfort and painfulness is quite an important one, it's really an important technique to address. We then look at some of the humanistic techniques on promoting well-being, how to cultivate optimism. Optimism is not just something that's given. There are some people who are born more optimistic than others, but we can actually learn to be more optimistic. We can learn and develop our sense of gratitude and how we savor life, and these are all very important to our well-being. And then we look at looking back, and it's interesting, in order to look forward, actually it's very important to look back first. So conducting a sort of life review can be a very important way of learning something about your strengths, something about how you've dealt with difficulties in the past, and then draw on that realization and reflections for how you might be able to address some of the challenges of later life. Then we look at how to look at the sort of the things that give us most meaning and purpose in life, and that's a very important area to look at. And finally, developing a vision for where we want to, using our mental visualization techniques can be very important in a way of setting our intention of how we want to, what we want to achieve in later life. And then we finish off looking at resilience and how to build mental resilience to get through the challenges of aging. So I just want to finish off with one other little reading. And one of the quotes, which is on the cover of the book, is that aging is inevitable, getting old is optional. The statement above encapsulates a key idea within the concept of positive aging. We patently can't prevent or delay the aging process, but we don't have to inhabit an identity which conforms to ageist stereotypes of being old. We need to resist such stereotypes because they do two things. First, they tend to impose a sort of self-censorship which limits our aspirations and curtails some of the activities or pleasures that we would otherwise experience. They foster self-limiting beliefs, which cause us to narrow rather than broaden our options. Second, ideas around being old actively trigger and perpetuate a range of negative self-fulfilling prophecies. If there's only one message that you take from this book, it should be to constantly guard against negative self-fulfilling prophecies. If you believe that you are going to feel worse as you age, then you can almost guarantee that you will experience that negative outcome. But you should also have picked up that positive aging is a rose-tinted spectacle-free zone. Aging, like any other time of life, will have joy and sadness. And like any other time of life, we can learn and gain satisfaction from dealing with sadness and challenges. Aging positively won't be all sweetness and light, but neither will it be all doom and gloom. The positive in aging positively refers to facing up to life, being proactive with our lives, making the most of it, and seeing the glass as half full, whilst recognizing that there is a shadow side as well. This book has been designed to open up the possibility of a radically different approach to aging. It challenges the notion that aging is something that just happens, that it has an inevitable and generally negative trajectory over which we have no power. My wish is that you have begun to realize that this is not the case. I hope you can now see that you can exert quite significant choice control over the sort of later life that you have. There is no claim here that you can make our aging trouble-free or euphoric, but there is the claim that we can actually exert significant influence over our satisfaction and well-being in our later years. Whilst we can't prevent ourselves from getting ill or experiencing loss, we do have some choices about the way we deal with challenging events, both emotionally and psychologically. This book is written in a spirit of challenge. We need to challenge the notion that the only good way to age is not to. So celebrate your next birthday, be proud of whatever age you are, accept that it will all come to an end at some point, but that until it does, you will treat each day as a precious gift and make the most of it in any way that feels right for you. Matt, that's what I want to say to begin our discussions.
You've got me smiling at the end, Guy, and it's well known that smiles and laughter create the shortest distance between people. I've read your book and I find it fascinating. Fascinating that you can say so much that's helpful about what we do in our dotage without ever addressing diet and exercise. Quite deliberately, I realize it's not an accident that you've avoided those things. And I'm intrigued by that, that this emphasis is on the psychological and the emotional. And one of our slogans at the Swindon Spring Festival is that life is for learning. And the hidden agenda on our program, don't tell anyone this, by the way, Guy, is that every event should have something to do with learning in it. Every author, whatever they're talking about. And I've noticed that people come out of a theatre and when they've had some pleasure and they've learned something new, they seem much happier. And I was looking in your book for where, bearing in mind it's psychological and emotional stuff that you're addressing, you would talk about learning new things in old age. Is there a role for that? Is that part of the positive message, learning something new?
Yes, it is, Matt. I mean, but the whole thing about agency is about taking control, and some of that is about learning new ways of being. And I do focus on the psychological and emotional, and there's a lot that we have to learn about ourselves in developing a more positive approach to aging. So if we take the life review notion, looking back over life is one way we can learn very clearly about ourselves. Being aware of our own ageist attitudes is a way of learning. So yes, it's endemic and part and parcel of this approach to positive aging. It's interesting you mentioned the thing about exercise and diet. And I'm not setting out an opposition to exercise and diet as being very important. They are. But I suppose I see that as the outside-in approach to having a good or better later life. And what I'm proposing here to complement, not an opposition, to complement the outside-in approach, is the inside-out approach. So looking within in order then to end out developing better outcomes in later life. So the two go together. If we have a better approach, more positive and more exerting more choice and control, then one of the things that tends to happen is we then see the importance of exercise and diet and looking after ourselves. So that research I talked about with Becca Levy about people whose attitudes are negative towards their own aging. There's no kind of magic thing that gives that very negative outcome of 7.5 years less life. It's actually very kind of straightforward when you think about it. If you have decided that getting old is pretty naff and is going to be pretty miserable and you're going to get ill, then you're less likely to take any steps to learn how to live better, to take that exercise, to go for a run, or to eat healthily, so people, or to go to medical appointments. So that mental attitude complements the whole physical and diet attitude as well.
Arthur Rubinstein, the pianist, was interviewed on his 92nd birthday, and the interviewer said, "You've done everything. You've had all the accolades. You're 92. Doubtless you're looking forward to resting on your laurels." And Arthur Rubinstein replied, No, tomorrow I was thinking of playing the piano with the left hand instead of the right hand." And at 92, he was out to learn something new. So I want to push on this a little bit more. And you have things like the University of the Third Age and so on, and notions that learning something wards off dementia. Do we lose our ability to learn things? Does learning new things help positive aging?
Yes, no, it's interesting you mentioned Rubinstein, because I actually did quote him in the book, because one of the ways of building resilience in life is we will experience some loss. So we may experience some physical loss, if we just look at that to begin with. And one of the ways of dealing with that, well, one way is just to kind of give up. I can't do that anymore. And what Rubinstein is, in the quote I use in the book, shows that although his fingers were not quite as fast as they had been in his youth, he used a variety of techniques to compensate for that, so that he gave the appearance that his playing was still as good. So he learned new ways of producing the same outcome, but in a different way than he did as he was younger. So I would suggest that's really, really important and relevant for what you've just mentioned. And yes, if you feel positive about life, it's very important. It's very difficult to see how you can't be about learning new things. So reading, challenging yourself. Challenging is really an important way of developing your well-being. As you say, things like the University of the Third Age and all the rest of it. There's a lot of misinformation about memory. It's again one of these myths that people just expect that memory will inevitably decline as one ages. It is not the case. Some aspects of memory do decline, but they start declining when people are 25 and 30, not when they're 65 or 80. But keeping, like any kind of muscle or anything you have, the more you challenge it, the more you exercise it, the more it'll be there. So keeping engaged in mental activities, I think more like reading or learning new things rather than doing Sudoku, which personally doesn't appeal to me. See how it kind of nourishes the soul. It occupies the time, but doesn't nourish the soul. And I think you, Matt, are probably much more interested in nourishing the soul than passing the time.
A couple of years ago, when I reached the age of 50, I read a book in which the author said, that was meant to be a joke, in which the author said, we can't do anything about our genes. Our genes come to us from our parents, and we have to accept our lot, and our genes can determine how we get on throughout life, and especially how we age. But he did say there were three very important things that were more important. He did a sort of top 10 of things that are important as you get older. But he said 3 of them are way ahead of the others. And I wonder what you think of them and what part they play in positive aging. And the 3 things were wealth, health, and relationships. Now, you've already spoken about relationships and the importance of those. And by wealth, he said he meant having enough so that you weren't perpetually worried about money. He didn't mean being a millionaire. And by health, he didn't mean you should run a marathon every day. He meant that your life is not in danger immediately. Was he onto something? I mean, how can you be positive if you haven't got those 3 things?
Okay, just working out where to start on that one. Health is very, very, well, no, let's start at it is quite, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, yeah, which is you need to have a home, you need to have food, you need to have a certain amount of money so that you're not in desperate trauma. So that goes without saying. If you haven't got these sort of things, you're not going to pick up a book like this and start getting into this sort of thing. So this is second order things. People need to have that ability, and also education and the kind of culture that allows them to engage with ideas above and beyond just dealing with the day-to-day. So that has ever been thus and always will be. Health as well, yes, that's really important, but again, that can be so overstated and misrepresented. I have in the book 2 pictures. I ask people to choose which picture represents positive aging. And one picture is of the 100-year-old marathon runner, and the other picture is of Stephen Hawkins. And I get so many people, you know, when I talk about positive aging, they tell me, or they send me emails and photographs of older people jumping out of airplanes or 100-year-old marathon runners and all the rest of it, and say, isn't that great? That's positive aging. Well, yes, but I want to say a big but. Yes, but. Because that, for me, associates positivity too much with physical ability. So what happens if you don't have physical ability? Stephen Hawkins had virtually no physical ability to do anything. Even to eat was very difficult. So was Stephen Hawkins someone, was the 100-year-old marathon runner better at positively aging? No, you can't tell from a picture. And when you hear or read some of the things Stephen Hawkins talked about in his life, yes, his health was dreadful, his disability was dreadful. But he talked about been internally feeling much better emotionally since he had that illness than before, not welcoming the fact that he had that illness. So again, we have this notion that ill health is something that's necessarily dreadful. It's not. I myself, I've had kidney failure, I've got a kidney transplant, I'm living a long-term illness, and on the statistics, when you read the health statistics, they might say, you know, 40% or 45% of older people with a long-term limiting illness, isn't that dreadful? Well, yes, there are some dreadful long-term illnesses, there definitely are. But also, particularly nowadays, people live with long-term limiting illnesses very well and get on very well. So that's the whole thing about health. In terms of genetics, yes, there are predispositions, and things like personality. Often people say, well, some people are just optimistic, some people aren't, some people are introverted and not extroverted and all the rest of it. And there are associations with different personality types and happiness and well-being. But you can use that as a sort of genetic determinism, which I think is really, there's no research evidence to suggest. We all have our default positions. But in life, most of us have realized in life that we have to sometimes go outside our comfort zone and learn new ways of responding in situations. And we learn to live with and moderate and extend beyond our limitations. So yes, your colleague had a point, but only so far as it goes.
Thanks, Guy. Now, Guy and I have been talking fairly seriously Not many laughs so far. But this book is fascinating in that well, first of all, it has a new pagination scheme where the page number is on the side of the page rather than the corner. I'm intrigued by that. Whether his publishers or he had a hand in it, I don't know. What it means is, and I look at a lot of books, that it's a very lively book. It has questionnaires. It's peppered. It's spiced and peppers with brilliant quotes ranging from Bob Dylan, Friedrich Nietzsche, Keith Richards, Abraham Lincoln, Ringo Starr, Mark Twain, Leonardo da Vinci, and then for good measure, a few ancients put in, Epicurus, Horace, Plutarch. It's remarkable. So it's one of those lively little books that I've been taking it to meal times and stopping other people chewing by saying, listen to this, or answer this questionnaire. So if you want to have that kind of fun, and now that we're all locked in, you do want to have fun, and you do want to be uplifted. This book does a lot for that. But I'm going to ask Guy one more question, and then we'll come to the end session.
Can I just interject there, Matt?
Yeah, go on.
While we're talking about fun, yeah. I just wanted to mention the fact, this is, I think, only the second book I've ever come across that has an accompanying playlist. And it's got a playlist of positive aging, or songs that I think convey the spirit of positive aging. And it's a free playlist. There's a Spotify link in the book, which takes you to this playlist. And it has a fantastic list of about 30 tracks of songs that will be uplifting and really represent the spirit of positive aging.
Guy, it's amazing that you draw people's attention to that, because that's the first thing that I noticed about this book. For some reason, I flicked through it when I got it from the publishers and went to the back and said, my goodness, a playlist. And there are some singers and musicians I don't even know, so I'm really looking forward to that. So there you are, apart from the questionnaires and the quotes, it's full of lively things. But I want to ask Guy a question. You know about age, and people even start doing it when you reach about 30, the jokes. What harm do the jokes do, the many jokes? Do they beaver away, do they gnaw away at something inside us? Or do they help us through difficulties, you know, especially the ones laced with irony and so on? Do you think there's a place for jokes about people who are over 50?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you invited us to recognise the joke you made about, you know, a couple of years ago when you were 50. Yeah. And I didn't rise to it because there is always the danger of being kind of sour-faced, kind of zealot.
Mostly modest, all sorts of silly things, yeah.
But there is there are all the jokes about, you know, people not wanting to reveal their age as they get older. And there is a movement about being age proud. And I think it's important just to recognize that you know, I'm 65, this is what a 65-year-old looks like. So when somebody says, oh my gosh, you look young, I don't really, well, I don't want to be the sour-faced zealot, so often I just let it go. But there is a serious point that some of these jokes do represent the fact that they're about this idea that getting old is something that is not welcome. And it's such a kind of prejudice against ourselves, because we are all hopefully going to get older. So it's a prejudice. So, you know, sometimes, you know, in post-feminist times, you can make some jokes about, you know, the whole sexual politics. I suppose in that way, one can be light-hearted, don't have to be completely serious, but there is a serious point behind some of the corrosive aspects of jokes about aging.
And there are jokes, and there are jokes, and some are better than others. Guy, we come to the end, or the end of this chat anyway. I've got 13 more questions that I wanted to ask you, but we haven't got time. I'm very keen on a section towards the back of the book called Giving and Purpose, and in later life, and how can we develop our sense of purpose in later life, and giving and purpose, and giving is the emphasis on the word giving. And I love the Pablo Picasso quote you've got there. This is it, folks. the meaning of life is to find your gift. The purpose of life is to give it away. And in this passage, he had a word that I had to look up, which is always great. Life's for learning and finding new words. And I actually, once I'd looked up and found what it meant, I challenged the people at supper and did call my bluff with them and said, eudaimonic, does it mean frustrated, fulfilled, or evil? And what do you think they said, Guy? Eudaimonic.
Well, I hope they said fulfilled, but
yeah.
Yeah.
And you talk about being fulfilled by gestures of generosity.
Well, it's all about the whole issue about meaning and purpose, and it is so important. And I obviously can't talk about it in detail at this point in our discussion, but there's so much research evidence to show that people who lack a strong sense of purpose in life, they don't live as well. They tend to end up getting dementia at much higher rates than anybody else, and have a pretty miserable life. And I kind of see it in my other work with older people, is see it all the time that often people after retirement, this whole notion of retirement is pretty odd in itself, after they've had this sort of 6 months honeymoon, they then begin to look around and think, well, what am I going to do? And people can really, there's a very strong prevalence of people kind of sinking into a bit of depression, anxiety, because they haven't got a reason for getting up in the morning. And actually, a lot of us can have that feeling during this horrible lockdown of not having a sense of purpose because our day-to-day lives are disturbed. So it's even very important within this context that we're living through now to have a sense of purpose during the day. And it's something that has to be constantly rekindled. But if you don't have that sense of purpose, that sense of what you get up in the morning for, that is really, it's a fast track into anxiety, depression, and a lack of satisfaction. It's also, I suppose it's counter, what's the word? The opposite is the sort of hedonic, the hedonism. So again, when people talk about later life, they often talk about, yeah, well, I'm going to generate my bucket list. And the bucket lists tend to be, you know, there's thrills and spills, and traveling to exotic places and all the rest. And there's, you know, these things are good and fine, but I suppose it's a little bit like some meals just don't fill you up, and sometimes just doing pleasurable things for pleasure's sake, and having nothing that is important to you above and beyond your own self and your own wishes. Then you tend to lack meaning and purpose in life. So eudaimonic is that idea of being involved in something above and beyond your own pleasure senses. Does that make sense?
And of course, as we all know, that doing those things, giving something of yourself away, creates relationships remarkably.
Yeah.
Again and again, I found that, and I'm sure you have, and many people have. So there one ticks off another box.
Yeah, and it's all about balance. You know, I tend to be a little bit of a dour sort of Scot who's all focused on, you know, the Protestant work ethic. But, you know, and I need to kind of get a little bit more hedonism in my life. So it is all about that balance. You can be too much one way and be a little bit miserable. And I've got a nice little diagram in the book that kind of shows there's an optimum place to be with hedonism and eudaimonic approaches to purpose.
Thanks very much, Guy. And as I've already said about this book, it's highly readable, and it makes you want to talk with someone. It makes you want to say, do you do this? And when you do the questionnaires, it wants to say, what score did you get? So it's full of stuff like that. You can get it from, well, I nearly said all good bookshops, but they're actually closed at the moment. But you can get it online. And you've heard about it here at the Swindon Spring Festival. And you're just about to thank the author for coming to the Swindon Spring Festival in a virtual sense, but we hope we'll see him live again one day. Guy, thank you very much for joining us. Till we meet again, everybody keep well, and Guy, you keep well too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. It's been a pleasure talking with you.